Judges Corner is brought to you by CoolStuffInc.com, the best online retailer for Magic the Gathering singles and sealed product, and gatheringmagic.com, your place to explore the game. Now it's time for Judges Corner.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Judges Corner. Today we're going to be taking a look at replacement effects, which are pretty much what they sound like. They replace part of an effect, or maybe the entire effect, or even a part of a turn with something else entirely, or something else sort of. Let's go ahead and begin by taking a look at what different replacement effects are and how you can identify them. Replacement effects in Magic are effects that replace part or all of an effect, an action, a part of a turn, or sometimes an entire turn. They are typically identified with words like instead or skip. In phrases such as, this permanent enters the battlefield with, or as this permanent enters the battlefield, or this permanent enters the battlefield as. Some continuous effects also have replacement effects if they read, this permanent enters the battlefield, or objects enter the battlefield. Even some morph effects are replacement effects, if stated like, as this permanent is turned face up. The important thing to know about them is that they do not use words like when, whenever, or at the beginning to signify their occurring. Those are what triggered abilities use, and unlike triggered abilities, replacement effects don't use the stack, and just automatically apply to whatever they can, and replace whatever they say they do. Be it the draw for turn, or a Ravnica dual land coming into play untapped, or loyalty counters being placed on a planeswalker. You can't really interact with replacement effects, and there really is no restriction keeping them from occurring. You can't torpor orb them or stifle them. They linger either until they apply to whatever event they were made for, or until their duration ends. Take regeneration, for example. If you apply a regeneration replacement effect to a permanent, it'll linger to replace any destruction event with a couple of things that make up regenerating. But if that replacement effect is used up, you'll need an entirely new one generated to protect the permanent from a second instance of destruction. Also, if it isn't used up by the time it expires at the end of the turn, you'll need to create another replacement effect of regeneration for the following turn if you want to prevent any later destruction. Fortunately, you can normally react to destruction events by activating the ability or casting the spell that sets up the regeneration replacement effect. Replacement effects always occur right before an event would occur, like a clone entering play. You would apply the replacement effect to the clone before it actually entered the battlefield, and not after. So if a clever impersonator and another creature were to enter the battlefield at the same time, you wouldn't be able to select the other creature as something to clone, since it's not actually on the battlefield before the impersonator entered play. Another example would be like with a revealed Overgrown Tomb on top of your library. If you were to play that Overgrown Tomb, you would need to decide to pay the 2 life to have the land come into play untapped before you'd get to see what the next card is on top of your library. So eventually, after playing Magic long enough, you'll run into multiple replacement effects that affect the same thing. For example, if I control a Notion Thief, and you control a Notion Thief, and you draw a card from your ponder, then my Notion Thief would try to steal your card, and then your thief would then in turn try to steal the card back. But then wouldn't that go back and forth forever with each trying to replace the other one? Fortunately, we handle this only by applying a replacement effect to a single event once. So once my Notion Thief has tried to bring me my opponent's card, he can no longer go back out and apply to that specific event ever again until it is finished. Then my opponent's thief will have stolen the card I stole from them, but since my thief is already applied to this chain of events, it can't get involved again, and ultimately the card will go to its original owner. We can make this scenario even more complicated by turning this into a multiplayer game, where instead both my opponent and I are trying to Notion Thief a third player's card draw. When multiple replacement effects are competing to do the same thing, we resolve this by letting the affected player, or the player who controls the affected thing, decide which replacement effect to apply first. So let's say they decide to apply our opponent's thief first. Because we don't use the stack to handle replacement effects, theirs just applies to the event right away, nullifying our other replacement effect from even qualifying to apply to it. However, this means our Notion Thief never applied itself to the event, and on top of that, it is now eligible to apply to the opponent's newfound card draw, generated by their own thieves thieving. And, more unfortunate for them, their thief is already applied to this replacement effect, to this specific event, so it has no choice but to fork over the right to draw a card. Replacement effects can also alter other replacement effects that have already replaced part of a card's text. For example, if your Notion Thief were to take a card your opponent was about to draw off of a ponder while you controlled a Blood Scrivener with no cards in hand, the Zombie Wizard's replacement effect would also apply after your Notion Thief allowed it to apply. The text of your opponent's ponder would go from, look at the top 3 cards of your library, put them back in any order, you may shuffle your library, draw a card, to all of that except the draw a card would now read, your opponent draws a card because of your Notion Thief. And then after that, Blood Scrivener would apply and change that line of text to say, your opponent draws 2 cards and loses 1 life. So that would mean you will draw 2 cards while your opponent ponders on what just happened. Another example of multiple replacement effects trying to affect the same thing would be like if your Planeswalker was about to be damaged by a lightning strike through the Planeswalker Redirection replacement effect, while that damage was about to be doubled by a Dictate of the Twin Gods. Here, there are 2 replacement effects applying to the damage affecting you, with one trying to double that damage dealt to a player, and the other trying to redirect that damage to a Planeswalker you control. Since you are the affected player in this example, instead of the opponent, it is you who decides the order in which to apply these. And this means you can have your Planeswalker end up taking 3 or 6 damage. There is an order in which we apply replacement effects, and we find that self-replacement effects are always applied over any other kind of replacement effects first. Self-replacement effects are effects that replace part or all of a spell or ability of a card generating the effect. For example, instants and sorceries with the ability Ferocious all have self-replacement effects that modify what the cards do if you control a creature with 4 or more power. Flashback is another example of self-replacement effects that modify what we normally do with a spell as it would go to resolve. And if we were to flashback a thing twice with an activated Soulfire Grandmaster's replacement effect, we'd find the flashback replacement effect will always occur first, due to the precedence of self-replacement effects, meaning it would be exiled rather than returning to your hand. The second kind of replacement effect we would apply before any others are control-changing replacement effects. Let's look at when Gather Specimens takes a Golgari Gravetroll. We would apply the Gather Specimens Change of Control effect before the Golgari Gravetroll's +1/+1 counter replacement effect. That means we would use our graveyard to determine how many counters the troll got, as opposed to our opponent's or the original controller's graveyard. The third kind of replacement effect applied after the first 2 are copy replacement effects, like with Clone. This means if we play Gather Specimens on our opponent's clone being cast, we would get to choose what to copy instead of our opponent's because the copy replacement effect happens after the control changing replacement effect. Finally, all other kinds of replacement effects that don't fall into the 3 previous categories are applied. Another rule about replacement effects is that you cannot choose to apply a zone-changing replacement effect to something that is currently trying to enter the battlefield. Like, if you were to reanimate a Sutured Ghoul, you couldn't exile itself to its own replacement effect, because it's trying to enter a different zone than where its replacement effect would take it. If you were instructed to skip the same thing multiple times, like if your opponent played multiple Stonehorn Dignitaries on the same turn, you would only apply one of those replacement effects to each combat, until each replacement effect had been satisfied. So, in other words, if your opponent plays 3 Stonehorn Dignitaries, you'd skip your next 3 combat phases, with each replacement effect being fulfilled 1 combat phase at a time. If this did happen, just be thankful that it was 3 Dignitaries instead of 100. It's important to note that while Stonehorn Dignitary's effect is a triggered effect, it does set up a replacement effect that occurs later on. If a replacement effect replaces a card draw when there is nothing to draw, it still replaces that action of drawing. Take, for example, Abundance with an empty library. You would technically never deck out and lose the game, so long as you kept replacing the draws with Abundance. So all you do is, during your draw step, you would say, land, and reveal cards from the top of your library until a land card appeared. But since you don't have any cards to reveal, the effect stops right there, with your draw for the turn basically being skipped, and you continue playing the game. If you replace a card draw with something else, any additional actions of the original effect will not be required to be completed. This is seen with Sylvan Library. Instead of drawing 3 cards and looking to keep any, you can replace all of the cards drawn from the enchantment and drawn for turn before it with, say, 3 dredge cards, and you won't be required to pay a total of 8 life for dredging 2 cards, instead of keeping 2 cards off of Sylvan Library, since you didn't actually draw them. Keep in mind that you will have to pay 4 life to keep any cards you do draw, though, if you don't dredge all 3 cards. Well, that's it for our episode. If you like this video or any of our other videos, we'd really appreciate it if you gave it a like. It really helps us out a lot. And if you have any questions about this video or anything else, you can always send us an email at judgescorner@gatheringmagic.com or leave a comment below and someone will be happy to get back to you as soon as possible. Until next time, make sure to shuffle thoroughly, play at a reasonable pace, and have fun.